Hello and welcome to this FB Live with RTI and human rights activist Venkatesh Nayak of Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative. We're here to talk about FCRA and the government's latest clampdown on foreign funding for NGOs. Welcome, Mr. Nayak.
Thank you.
So let's dive right into it. So
Sure.
recently, the government cut the foreign funding for the license for specific 6 or 7 organizations that were critical of the Modi government. And to back that, now the Ministry of Home Affairs has cancelled the license for 20,000 organizations, NGOs in India. What do you think lies behind all of this?
Well, unfortunately, the government does not always disclose its reasons publicly when they take any of this kind of action. So a lot of discussion that happens is in the domain of speculation, which is extremely unfortunate. But the general perception is, and within the NGO sector, there is a very strong perception that of late, the steps being taken by the government of India in either cancelling the foreign funding license of NGOs or not renewing the licenses of NGO that have whose original license have expired, because the new law permits licenses to be given only once in 5 years.
Right.
Now, there are several cases where I have heard of at least 2 or 3 cases where some of the NGOs, the very prominent ones, working on issues of human rights, working on issues of accountability, governance reform and all of that, have been told that in the national interest, in the public interest, and based on field agency reports, their applications are not being renewed or their existing licenses are being cancelled. Now, what exactly do these reports contain is not in the public domain. So therefore, there is a dearth of information about the reasons behind the action of government in invalidating the licenses of several NGOs, refusing to renew the licenses of several thousand NGOs, which actually are working at the ground level on a range of human rights issues. And that is extremely worrisome.
But a lot of civil society activists have said that this is the government's way to sort of clamp down on dissent if they're critical of the government in any way or through their initiatives. So this is their way of clamping down on dissent. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yes, of course. You see, I think last year I had done an RTI application with the Foreigners Division, which actually controls the FCRA, the whole procedure,
Okay.
and asked them, since the coming in of the new law in 2011, it was passed in 2010 and operationalized in 2011 with the notification of the rules under the FCRA law. I had asked, in how many instances had they refused to give license or they had cancelled licenses of organizations by labeling them as organizations of a political nature?
Okay.
Okay, there were none. This was last year. But now this year, we are coming across several instances where the government seems to be saying that it is not in the public interest to renew the licenses of these NGOs.
Okay.
So obviously, the surmise or the conjecture that one could draw from this, or maybe the inference that one could draw from these actions, is now increasingly the government is targeting NGOs for speaking out against its policies, for speaking out against the current paradigm of economic development, which does not take into account the human rights protections that are guaranteed to the affected people by our constitution and by various laws. So questioning the methodology of ensuring quick development is now becoming dangerous for a lot of NGOs that are foreign funded, and that is extremely unfortunate, because when the constitution guarantees the right to freedom of speech and expression, implicit in that fundamental right is the right to express one's dissent, the right to express one's disagreement with the government's policies. Otherwise, it would become a completely autocratic and a despotic dispensation.
Right.
The whole idea of democracy is the accommodation of a variety of views on any issue. And foreign funding, to a certain extent, I wouldn't say to a large extent, to a certain extent, does help a lot of NGOs which are not able to raise local sources of funding to mobilize themselves, question the way government does its work, and also do the research that is necessary to be able to show some of the problem areas in the government's developmental policies. Now, all of that is facilitated through funding. It's not available locally, so there are donors abroad who support that kind of work. And that is something not unique to India. It is a common trend across the globe in many, many developing countries, because governments very often are in a hurry to ensure economic development at that level, their level. Perhaps the logic is certainly defensible, but then when it impacts on people's lives at the ground level, then the other side of development, where the dangers, the displacement, the uprooting of people's lives and livelihoods need to be taken into account, and the effect on the environment that it has, like mining or other kinds of extractive operations. Now, for NGOs to be able to expose all of that, certain source of funding is required. Locally, money is not available for doing that kind of work. Philanthropic organizations would be happy to give you money for running schools and hospitals, but they will not give you money for doing this kind of research, talking to people, sharing those findings, and mobilizing their opinion to say that, hey, can we take a second look? Can we have an alternative way of approaching development? And that is where I think the curbs on foreign funding are really affecting what I would say is legitimate civil society action.
No, but sort of to play the devil's advocate here, do you think a silver lining here would be that the Indian organizations, the Indian NGOs, they would be forced to tap into the Indian market of philanthropy, like, because now they cannot get funds from abroad. They sort of have to explore the Indian avenue. So do you think that could be like a silver lining here?
You see, explorations are definitely possible where there is potential.
Okay.
I have been working in the NGO sector for almost 17 years now, and I know for a fact that if you want to engage in service provision, like for example running a school, running a midday meal scheme, or let us say developing self-help groups amongst women's groups in villages, there is money available.
Okay.
But to be able to do research on, let us say, the environmental impact of a large dam, the environmental impact of a thermal power project, that requires money. Because a lot of research goes into it, experts have to be hired. There is simply no money for it. So this business of Indian NGOs now making the effort to explore whether local funding is available would be a reasonable thing to expect only if there are potential sources of funding.
Okay.
There are hardly any NGO, any philanthropic organizations in the country which support this kind of work, and that is extremely worrisome because in many other countries, a lot of money from very legitimate sources, which are all accounted for under the tax laws of the country, goes into supporting this kind of work in various developing countries. Not only in USA, not only in the United Kingdom or France. There are NGOs which do this kind of work even in those countries. But then donors based in those countries who use money that is given to them by legitimate taxpayers use that money to support the work of NGOs elsewhere.
Okay.
And this is increasingly a phenomenon that has developed since the globalization phase that we are seeing post 1990s onwards. Civil society has, the sector has expanded considerably. And foreign funding for this kind of work has also expanded considerably. And the reason why foreign funding supports this kind of work in India is because, like I said earlier, local funding is simply not available for this kind of work in any large measure.
Okay. Like we said that yesterday, 20,000 organizations lost their FCRA license. How do you think in total this will impact the NGO sector? Will the grassroots programs will be the first ones to go? And what about the people who are employed in this sector?
You see, when the print and electronic media report on these kinds of issues, there is a certain amount of sensationalism also that goes into it. I mean, please pardon me for saying it. When you mention figures in the thousands, it certainly looks like a big story. But you need to really look at what was the reason behind the refusal to renew the license of these NGOs. My own personal experience shows that there are lots of small organizations that are based in different parts of the country that do not entirely depend upon foreign funding for their entire period of existence. It might be for a specific project that they've received foreign funding, and once the project is completed, they probably do not need more foreign funding for that purpose, as a result of which they may not have applied for any renewal of their licenses. So to club those kinds of cases together and with those other cases where the government is actively refusing to renew the license of NGOs, like for example in the context of Greenpeace or the organizations headed by Tista Satilwad or Lawyers Collective for that matter, where there is a clear order from the government saying we will either cancel your FCRA license or we are not going to renew based on your application. So these two categories of NGOs have to be separated. There are lots of NGOs which do not really use foreign funding year on year, as a result of which they may not have applied. So that also gets included in the counting of the several thousands.
Right.
And at the same time, there might be NGOs that have been established for a specific purpose. Their purpose is over and they are no longer functional. And therefore they have not applied for renewal. So those numbers also get counted. As a result of which, it looks like that the government is doing something really big by cutting down, at the NGO sector and reducing the total number of NGOs that are receiving foreign funding by refusing to renew licenses. That is just the, I would say, it's an image that has been just drawn up. The reality lies, down below. One needs to look into every single case where an NGO has either applied for license or has not applied for license, and then the figures need to be separated on that basis. There are also instances in the same category of thousands of NGOs. There is another category of NGOs that have not completed the procedure for renewal that is required under the Act and the rules. As a result of which, they have been given extra time to fill up those deficiencies and come back. So those also get included. Saying because obviously in their case also the licenses have been renewed. So this business of 20,000 NGOs or whatever that is being reported in the print and electronic media, they need to be probed a little more deeply in order to find out in each case what were the reasons for not renewing them. And then you will see that perhaps the NGO sector, the way it's being turned into a villain, is not really a case in point.
Okay, so government claims that a lot of people or a lot of NGOs, when they take these foreign funding, they sort of misuse these funds, or sort of they are responsible for creating disturbance for infrastructure projects. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that is increasingly becoming a worrisome trend as far as the development debate in India is concerned. Now, unlike the previous FCRA law, which was passed in 1976, FCRA law is actually an emergency era law. It was brought in 1976 primarily for the purpose of curbing the political parties' reach to foreign funding, because the primary purpose of the law was to prevent political parties and media houses from securing foreign funding for any of their activities. Now, the 2010 law extends that to the NGO sector, because in 1976, you would remember that the NGO sector was not as expansive as it is today. So there were very few NGOs whom you could target under the old law. But now under the new law, there are thousands of NGOs around the country. Anyway, so they are being targeted. A lot of NGOs, like I said earlier, are in the field, working in the field, looking at the manner in which developmental projects, infrastructure projects, road projects, thermal power projects, or let us say hydropower projects are affecting people's lives. Let me also tell you what is problematic with the developmental paradigm that is being followed in India. Your viewers may not agree with it, but this is a very strong opinion that not just the intellectuals of this country are voicing, but people whose lives are really affected by the developmental projects are actually saying. And that happens case after case after case, which is today in any major city like in Delhi or Bangalore or Mumbai or Calcutta, you will not have the government coming forward to say, we will clear up this area and set up a thermal power project. Why? The cost implication of setting up such a project in the middle of an urban center is much more, in terms of land, in terms of displacement, and in terms of the opposition that would come from the highly educated and well-organized set of people who live in these cities. It is easiest, it is cheapest, and it is much more expeditious for these developmental projects to be implemented in areas where people are not so highly educated, where they are eking a hand-to-mouth existence. A lot of them are marginal farmers, or a lot of them are simply non-land-owning agricultural laborers. It's much, and they are not very well mobilized. It's much easier to take away their lands. For example, lands that are under the use or control of tribal communities. Very often they don't understand the developmental paradigm that is happening, that is being designed, for the whole country. No effort is being made to explain to them what would be the advantages of having these kinds of development projects there, how it will directly affect their lives positively and negatively. Instead, efforts are made to just displace them so that we can get our electricity, we can get our resources for leading our the kind of lifestyle that we are used to in the cities. As a result of which, these NGOs which feel that this is completely violative of the fundamental rights of those people, number one. And number two, it is completely violative of the directive principles of state policy, where in Article 39, it says very clearly the government has a duty to ensure that the sources of production and wealth that is created, it does not lie in the hands of just a few. It doesn't get concentrated there. It has to be shared equitably. That's why the preamble of the Constitution also says that we are not just a sovereign democratic republic, we are also a socialist republic. Okay. the word may not really make much sense in today's post-liberalized, and globalizing context of India, but it's still written into the constitution. It can't be ignored. So what the NGOs are doing is simply holding up a mirror to the government and saying, hey, there is a developmental policy that is written into the constitution which says that your developmental paradigm has to ensure equitable growth for everybody. But what you are doing here is that it is helping one set of people while having a completely deleterious negative and adverse impact on several other sets of people. If you were to take any large developmental project which requires large swathes of land to be acquired, under the Indian law, until recently, compensation was made under the law to be given only to the landowners. What happens to people who have other kinds of rights in land? Those who are tenants there, those who are farmers, those who are agricultural laborers. What happens to the service providers and the artisans who are all intimately integrated into the rural economy of that area, who are not landowners and therefore are not entitled to any compensation?
Right.
What happens to their livelihoods? Who's going to talk about them? The government, going by this well-known principle in law, which is called parens patriae, where the state becomes like a parent of those people who can't defend themselves for their rights. The state is not performing that obligation. So who else will do it? It has to be the brothers and sisters of those very people who will speak up for themselves and say that, look, demand your rights, ask for proper rehabilitation, ask for resettlement, ask for proper compensation. So when this kind of activity is being done, and when this is supported by foreign funding, the government says that no, you are anti-national or you are anti-development. This very business of portraying NGOs which get people to voice their demands, voice their concerns, and demand the fulfillment of their constitution-given rights, when they are villainized in the name of foreign funding, that becomes hugely problematic. Because you cannot have a road roller steamrolling development throughout. You've got to take everybody's concerns into consideration, for the simple reason that our democracy is not about majoritarian rule. Our democracy is about governing with the consent of everybody who is affected by the actions of government. And that, unfortunately, is not something which is sinking into this whole policy making process as far as development is concerned. And when NGOs raise these issues, they become the targets of these kinds of actions, and that is usually problematic.
Right, Mr. Nayak, like you mentioned that the act initially was meant to sort of keep a check on the funding for media houses and political funding. But the new amendment sort of makes it easier for political parties to get funds from foreign firms. Do you think that undermines the FCRA?
This is completely difficult to digest. There was a case that was taken to the Delhi High Court by the Association for Democratic Reforms, pointing out that despite the bar on foreign funding, which is very explicitly written into the FCRA law, two major national level political parties, one in the opposition, one in government, received funding from those companies which are subsidiaries of these multinational corporations that operate abroad. So technically there was a violation of the foreign contribution regulation law. So what happened? This year, when the budget was passed, in the finance bill, one clause was introduced to amend the FCRA to permit these kinds of bodies to get funding from the subsidiaries of foreign companies. So now everything is fine. As far as political parties are concerned, they can get funding from the Indian subsidiaries of foreign companies. Earlier that was not allowed.
Okay.
But that was not all. That clause was made applicable with retrospective effect to take away the effect of the Delhi High Court judgment. And that is hugely problematic, because when on principle it is being shown that the actions of these two political parties was unlawful, illegitimate and undesirable, you get Parliament to pass a law without any opposition to it, saying that we will change the law with effect from the date of the judgment. That is hugely problematic, and that is why of course that amendment does affect other NGOs also. In addition to political parties, NGOs can also get foreign funding from the Indian subsidiary companies, but that's not the point. The point is that when it comes to application of the law, the Constitution is very clear. Article 14 says equal treatment for everybody before the law. Now, if that is equal treatment for everybody before the law, these two political parties which had violated the FCRA should have borne the consequences. Instead, the law itself was changed with retrospective effect. So when it suits them, they will change the FCRA law. When it suits them, they are going to use it against the dissenting NGOs. And it is not just this present government. Let me make it very clear to your viewers. The new FCRA law was brought in under the UPA regime.
Okay.
and with support from the opposition that was there at that point of time, who are now in the treasury benches. So both sections are in fact quite united to oppose foreign funding for questioning any of these bringing any of these kinds of questions in the public domain about how the government is going about doing its development work. And that is what is problematic.
Right, and a lot of civil society activists, they've also said that government is sort of just targeting only the organizations or majorly targeting the organizations that work for the upliftment of Dalits and Muslims. What do you?
Yes, of course. That is the other irony as far as the philanthropic sector in India is concerned. In 1947, when India became independent, and in 1950, when the constitution was enforced, untouchability and caste-based discrimination were all by law prohibited. But to this very date, prohibition and caste-based discrimination continues. Discrimination against Dalits continues. Discrimination against Adivasis continues. Discrimination against minorities continues in a variety of ways. There can be no doubt about that. Where is the funding available for locally from local philanthropic organizations for the purpose of mobilizing these people to be able to demand their rights? It's simply not available. So it's only natural that they seek foreign funding. And now increasingly we are seeing that it is these kinds of NGOs who are being attacked. I'll give you an example. Without even getting into the issue of caste-based discrimination or whatever, there is an organization called People's Watch Tamil Nadu. Their FCRA license has not been renewed.
Okay.
And for some time it had been suspended and also cancelled during the previous government. And one of the reasons why they had been treated in that manner was because they supported the fisher folk, the men and women and children who were sitting in Kudankulam, where the nuclear power plant has been established with support from Russia, where they were demanding transparency in relation to the effect that the nuclear power plants would have on the sea right next door, on their livelihoods as fishermen, and what actions would be taken by the government in case there is a nuclear fallout of the kind that we saw in Fukushima because of an earthquake. There is simply no clarity on any of that. So all that People's Watch was doing was helping them to stay mobilized and raise their voices, use the law to ask for information. A lot of RTI applications were filed by people from that movement. And even the Central Information Commission ordered disclosure of those documents, but till date, there has been very little transparency, and all that the government has made available in the public domain is what it decides that people should know. The safety analysis report, the site analysis report, all of which are ordinarily put in the public domain in other countries regarding nuclear reactors, are not available in the public domain in our country. So all that these people were doing with some assistance from People's Watch was to demand accountability and transparency. And that was one of the reasons why their FCRA was taken away. So they also are the organization which raises issues about extrajudicial killings, about custodial torture. And those have also become the reasons why they have been attacked. And their FCRA was suspended and then was cancelled, and they're almost decimated as an organization. And now we've been told that in the latest round of applications for renewal, they have been refused. Again, based on field reports from agencies. What do these reports contain? What are they talking about? Do they even contain anything in terms of the concerns of the local people there? So you see, what the interesting part, again I bring it back to the developmental paradigm in the country, is that you are using that area which is inhabited by the fisher folk. Their livelihoods have been connected with the ecology of that area for several generations. The power that is supplied is going to the cities, whereas their own homes are dark today. And if an NGO raises these issues, they are going to be targeted. Now, why is that kind of attitude adopted by the government is a question that every tax-paying citizen should be asking. Rather than simply look at the electricity that powers our homes, we should be asking why the benefits of that project are not reaching out to the people whose lives have been uprooted by those development projects in those areas. And this is the story right from the beginning. I am told, a few years ago I did some research and I found out that there are people families who were displaced by one of the earliest of our developmental projects, which is the Bhakra Nangal Dam. They have still not been properly rehabilitated after 60 years. Isn't this unfair?
Right.
There are people in the south eastern part of Uttar Pradesh who have been displaced several times in one generation. First, because there was the dam that was being constructed, the Rihan Dam. Then because there was a Singrauli thermal power project that was constructed. Then a third time because they had to create some ash dumps. So the same people are being made to pay the price again and again for somebody else to develop. Is that a fair treatment of the citizens of this country? Why should this one set of people be responsible for paying the cost of somebody else's development? NGOs should be raising these questions. If the government is not asking these questions, there has to be a set of people who will raise these questions on behalf of the people. And those are these NGOs.
Right, and
they are being targeted.
Right, Ms. Nayak, finally to wrap it up, as an RTI activist, do you think these NGOs should be subject to RTIs?
Certainly, you see, under the law, if any NGO receives government funding for substantial amount, then they are to be treated as public authority just like any other government department. I'm completely in favor of having laws that would make NGOs directly accountable to the people if they are working for the people. There is no doubt about that. But today you have a situation where the Right to Information Act itself is being ignored. It is being weakened through practice by a whole range of public authorities. The Lokpal law makes all foreign funded NGOs that receive foreign contribution above 10 lakh rupees directly accountable under the Prevention of Corruption Act for the purpose of corruption. Okay. So we are already there. There is no question of saying that foreign funded NGOs are not transparent or accountable. But what has happened in the process is that one law which actually required every government servant, every public servant to be transparent about his or her assets and liabilities has been amended during the last session. And today, this requirement of proactive disclosure of information is, as far as assets and liabilities disclosures are concerned, that has been done away with through an amendment. So on the one hand, the government is not setting up the Lokpal. The law was passed in 2013. The Lokpal has not been constituted till date. But on the other hand, the government said that the disclosure of assets and liabilities for government servants is now going to be indefinitely extended beyond 31st December. They don't need to submit their returns anytime soon because the rules have changed, the law has changed, the rules have to be changed, forms have to be notified, but there is no such notification that has come from foreign funded NGOs. So technically, by the 31st of December, all of us who are part of foreign funded NGOs have to disclose our assets and liabilities to the government. So there is again a dual treatment, one given for government servants, one given for employees of NGOs. And what exactly is happening? Is this a question of confusion as far as policy is concerned? Is this a question of deliberate targeting of NGOs is concerned? There is no clarity on that. And that is why it is absolutely essential that whenever these kinds of decisions are taken, the government has to place all the facts and figures in the public domain beyond talking about how many thousands that they have managed to target. The basis on which they refused to renew the license of every NGO should be put in the public domain. It's as simple as that, because they issue an order against the application of every NGO which has applied for foreign funding. All that you need to do is put a copy of that in the public domain. It's as easy as that. You don't really need to recreate information in order to ensure that there is transparency. You just have to put that. But the government has they have steadfastly refused to put that in the public domain, treating it as a matter between the NGO and the government itself, and which is not the case.
Right. One of our viewers, Sudha, asked, can Indian philanthropy play more of a role in supporting the NGOs?
Yes, of course. Given the current scenario and the refusal of the government to treat foreign funded NGOs in an even-handed manner, which is to be expected from any government. There is a case for the Indian philanthropic sector to look at its priorities and perhaps revisit the priorities and ensure that there is enough money available to provide to NGOs who work on issues of human rights, who work on issues of governance and accountability and also transparency. So the Indian philanthropic organizations need to take that call. In fact, if you see, the irony about charity in India is based on figures, and most recently the figures have become all the more apparent in the drive to demonetization, to demonetize the economy. Several lakh rupees of donations in old notes were made to temples. Because temples have a way of converting them anyway. Now we don't know what would be the quid pro quo to the person who gave the donation. But if the same person had that much money and wanted to make good use of it, they could have certainly given that money to NGOs which are talking about the rights of the underprivileged in this country. That has not happened. There is money for religion and charity. I certainly would not want to be a person who would criticize people who would give money out for as charity to religious institutions. That of course is their hard-earned money. It is their right. But also please look at the huge inequalities and inequities that exist in our system. And perhaps a part of that money, if they could donate to NGOs which speak for the rights of the marginalized and underprivileged, perhaps the merit that they would expect in return for whatever religious charity would be actually visible at the ground level if they were to share some of that money with the NGOs who are doing some of this kind of work. It would certainly lead to efforts being made to improve the lives of these people. And that is why the philanthropic sector, I would say, in India needs to look at how they need to review and reprioritize their areas where they would be giving out funding.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Nayak. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for our viewers for joining us for this Facebook Live.